The idea of evolution by natural selection didn't come to Darwin in a vacuum. Many of his contemporaries were working on related problems, and the results from their research prompted him to think in a particular way that eventually led him to that idea. Starting first with Carolus Linnaeus, this gentleman down here, a Swedish biologist who was the first one to start lumping species into categories. So in his largest work, he actually sorted out 7,300 species of plants, giving each species an individual name. This helped Darwin think about the great diversity of life on Earth, and also this idea of how would you organize all of the life. Maybe putting them in groups according to who's the most related would make the most sense, and that sort of got Darwin on this idea that organisms might be related to each other. Later in the 1700s, two geographers, Lyell and Hutton, both coordinated on looking at changes that were happening to the physical Earth, and proposed the hypothesis that mountains form thanks to very slow movements in the Earth's crust that help those mountains sort of push up above ground level. Also that mountains and hills will wear away by erosion, and that since we can see these processes today, it makes sense to assume that those same processes have been shaping the Earth since the beginning. So this gave the idea that the Earth changes gradually over time. Hutton called that gradualism. And Lyell called this idea that whatever processes we can see today are the same ones that shaped the Earth back before we were around. And so together, the both of them said, all right, well, if mountains are really formed by the Earth changing and moving its crust and torn down by erosion, that must mean that the Earth is way older than we thought. Another of Darwin's contemporaries was named Thomas Malthus, and Thomas was actually an economist, not a biologist, but he was noticing in England this pattern where as populations got larger and larger, there would be more diseases, there would be more wars, and so on. And so he got this idea that if populations keep growing, they won't be able to grow indefinitely. They're going to bump up against limits, like limits of food, there'll be increased disease, there will be more competition between organisms. As you guys know, Darwin thought a lot about competition, and so Malthus was sort of the first one to introduce that idea of competition while looking at the human population, and then Darwin said, hey, that might be what's happening to all organisms. Meanwhile, in France, Lamarck was working on an idea of how evolution might happen. He already understood that organisms change over time, kind of the way the Earth changes over time. And he developed an idea. It wasn't very scientifically accurate, but it was an interesting one nonetheless. He thought that organisms would their bodies would change based on what they did. So if they really used their arms or a claw or their eyes a lot, then that organ would grow thanks to its use, and organs that they didn't use would get smaller over time. And then once an organism grew a really long neck, really sharp claws, what have you, it would then pass on that trait to the next generation. And so slowly from generation to generation, organisms would acquire traits that are useful to themselves and then pass them on. A false idea, because acquired traits can't be passed on, but still it got Darwin thinking about this idea of organisms changing over time. Now, Darwin wasn't the only one to realize that Lamarck didn't know what he was talking about. There was also this guy, Alfred Wallace, who was working at the same time as Darwin, who independently came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection. So in contrast with Lamarck, they didn't think that organisms could use body parts and have them grow and then pass on those grown body parts to the next generation. It was simply that idea that the organisms that started with the perfect body parts survived and then passed on that trait. So Wallace thought of that idea independently of Darwin. And actually, so Darwin was busy thinking about his idea and was unsure if he wanted to publish it. And then Wallace sent him a letter and said, hey, I hear you're working on this project. So I just had this idea. I wanted to see what you thought of it. And basically gave Darwin the exact same idea. And Darwin was like, oh crap, somebody else thinks this too. Awesome, I guess I'm going to publish. And that was one of the things that got him to publish his Origin of Species. Neither Darwin nor Wallace understood how in natural selection these traits that were advantageous were getting passed to the next generation. Coincidentally, back in his monastery, Gregor Mendel at this time was breeding his peas and figuring out how alleles were dominant or recessive to each other and how they got passed from the parent generation to the next offspring generation to the next offspring generation, working all by himself. How fascinating it would have been if he had met Darwin and they had had a chance to chat and Darwin could understand, oh, organisms are passing on a chemical code, some sort of gene to the next generation. But Darwin had no idea that was going on. It's just a funny coincidence that this research was going on at the same time. The moral of this story is, though Darwin was a brilliant scientist and he thought long and hard and he was brave to publish his ideas, he wasn't alone in this. Yes, he was challenging the status quo with his daring ideas, but those ideas were built on the shoulders and on the hard work of other scientists. And science is always a collaborative effort. So if you guys decide to become scientists at some point, it's important for you to think about what you're contributing with your research and what future ideas will be built upon your own.